And then
Hi, welcome, Melissa. Yep, just
thanks.
put your screen on. Yep, you're good to go, I think. We just can't see you.
I'll keep my video off till question period just because I'm at home and my internet is not fantastic. So I will
Yeah,
just
don't want it
keep
to
it
drop
off.
out.
Yes.
Okay. Yep, go ahead.
Perfect. Well, thank you for having me today and listening to my talk. I'll be presenting on the Victorian Coastal Wetland Restoration Program. Firstly, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I'm presenting from today in Melbourne, the Wurundjeri people, but also acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which this restoration project activities occur on, which include the Wadawurrung and the Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nation and the Gunner Kanai. I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. I also want to acknowledge and thank all of our project partners that have made this program possible. As you can see from the screen, it really is a multidisciplinary program, and we would not have been able to achieve everything that we have without their support. So starting off, I'll just go through a broad overview of the programs and its components, and then I'll dive into each of the specifics. So for program one, we're developing a restoration action plan to take a former salt works and transform it back into a natural wetland to improve the existing ecological features, which includes bird biodiversity and blue carbon. Program two involves completing on-ground low-cost coastal wetland restoration works, such as fencing and weed management to preserve and improve wetland habitat. For program three, we're working alongside Wadawurrung traditional owners to protect the largest known cluster of cultural heritage sites across the coastal landscape within Port Phillip Bay. And finally, for program four, this involves us engaging the community in appreciating coastal wetlands, while also having them contribute to the ongoing monitoring of the on-ground works through citizen science events. So for program one, we're working with UNSW Water Research Lab, Parks Victoria, the Nature Conservancy, out at Avalon Coastal Reserve to help rehabilitate the area back into a coastal wetland. Avalon Coastal Reserve is located just south of the Avalon Airport in Victoria, near Geelong. And as you can see from this historic photo, it originally was low-lying coastal wetland, but in the 1950s, Cheetham Salt Works purchased and leased some of the land at Avalon to construct an additional salt field. And the first harvest of salt was in 1954. Cheetham concluded the operations in 2002 and maintained limited operations across the site until 2017, when their lease agreement was up and it was handed back to the Crown. And that's when Parks Victoria took over the responsibility for the management of the site. And now Parks Victoria is seeking expert advice on how best to manage and or restore the site. And as you can see from the photo, there's lots of ponds, levees, tidal channels. That the first step to restoring the site is to first understand how the water flows across the site and how might that change under the different restoration scenarios. To do this, the UNSW Water Research Lab conducted topographic and bathymetric surveys around the site and installed some water level loggers. They and measured the water levels for a period of 6 months. They also surveyed all of the hydrologically relevant features such as tide gates, tide channel cross sections, and levees. Fortunately, there was an existing digital elevation model of Avalon Coastal Reserve, but the team did then correct it with the data collected during the field campaign, and that was to ensure that it represented the current site conditions well. It was then applied to a GIS-based inundation model, which you see in the animation here. And this was just to get an initial feel of how the site hydrology could look after restoring the flows. So the team has developed several restoration scenarios, which range from minimal intervention, which is kind of business as usual, no changes, to a fully engineered solution that allows us to tightly control the water flow across the site, the timing of it, the water depth. These sets of scenarios are currently being tested on a detailed hydrodynamic model, and this model will simulate the hydrological outcomes of the different restoration scenarios. And once we get those results for each of these hydrological outcomes, the secondary outcomes such as the distribution and abundance of intertidal vegetation communities, fishery productions, and waterbird habitat suitability will then be quantified to ensure that the key site ecological features and stakeholder requirements are met. And the aim is to optimize outcomes for both birds and salt marsh habitat. Migratory birds fly tens of thousands of kilometers each year to use these ponds to overwinter. So it's critical that when they come back to visit, that there is habitat for them there. The team is undertaking several research projects to collect data that will help us best predict these secondary outcomes. We've currently just kind of wrapped up collecting a lot of this data. So the publications are in prep and hopefully released over the next 12 months. We looked at greenhouse gas emissions and carbon storage capacity in the salt ponds and did some lab experiments looking at what would happen if you did freshen these up. We are looking at local scale drivers of carbon accumulation variability in like simple elevation gradient. And then we're also looking at it in areas with more complex topography where elevation and inundation become uncoupled. We're also looking at variability in carbon stocks, sequestration, and cycling among the 5 different salt marsh community types. And then finally, we'll be consulting with BirdLife Australia on the bird habitat suitability outcomes as well. So the next steps is calculating these secondary outcomes based off the results from the hydrological outcomes. We'll then complete a cost-benefit analysis based off the different scenarios and the outcomes that they achieve. We'll present our restoration action plan to the key stakeholders, and if a suitable scenario is chosen, we'll look to register the project once the ERF blue carbon method comes out. For program 2, we are undertaking on-ground restoration work to protect and restore salt marsh along the Victorian coast. We're working with Parks Victoria to install fencing to prevent livestock from grazing and trampling salt marsh. As you can see from the photo here, a fence has massive impact and is low cost. These are what some of our rehab sites look like originally before we fenced. The cows pug the soil, remove the vegetation, which allows weeds to come in. So by preventing cows from coming in, we're hoping that the salt marsh can naturally regenerate. And so far, we've installed about 1,200 meters of fencing to restore 15 hectares of salt marsh. And we have more sites planned in the next 12 months. This is one of our sites at in Western Port, Victoria. And what's interesting about this site is it's composed of several different areas that we can look at the recovery of salt marsh right away. So we have a Parks Victoria Reserve in the green, which has been protected in natural salt marsh for about 17 years. And then in the blue, we have a 2-year protected salt marsh on private property. The farmer also is actively grazing, maintaining an grazed area. And then in the white, we have our area that we've fenced off. That's a rehab. So we're able to essentially look at how different parameters recover. So we're monitoring the recovery of the salt marsh and the biodiversity. We're undertaking vegetation and bird surveys, monitoring the greenhouse gas emissions, the carbon cycling, and the soil accumulation. And later this month, we have a few more tea bags to pick up, and then we'll have collected all the data from that project. We've also completed some initial modeling, which estimates that there's about 20,000 hectares of land along the Victorian coast where you could potentially fence to protect and naturally regenerate salt marsh. So we recently just secured some additional funding to begin to undertake some more detailed modeling. We'll look to develop a land use model to produce a spatial heat map of suitable fencing area for restoration along the Victorian coast. In order to capture the temporal dynamics of the salt marsh distribution, the model will account for future sea level rise scenarios along the different regions of the coast. We will want to deliver this as a web platform and also incorporate it into DELP's Coast Kit. And then based upon if the restoration happens, we'll estimate the ecosystem services values that would come back as a result of the restoration. So a little bit further east, we're working with Greening Australia down the Gippsland Lakes to rehabilitate a site that's about 90 hectares. This private property land parcel sits along the shores of Lake Wellington, and the landowner purchased the property about 4 years ago and weren't really sure what to do with it, but we're wanting to improve the environmental value of the wetland that was on the property. So our lab and UNSW Water Research Lab are now undertaking an assessment to determine the suitability of the site for increasing the water connectivity to Lake Wellington. Greening Australia undertook a drone survey to get an accurate elevation model across the site, which you see in the middle photo, and most of it is a wetland, but to the far right, you'll see a road and then Lake Wellington's on that side. So we're assessing whether we're going to create a simple hydro inundation model to see whether if you open up some historic channels that have been filled in with vegetation and some sediment, whether you'll get good water flow across the site. Also on the same property, we have done some weed management works. Vegetation mapping across the site has shown that there was some quality brackish grasslands that have been shrinking in size due to encroachment by various shrubs and limiting the important water bird nesting grounds. And these are particularly important for the blue-billed duck and the locally culturally significant musk duck. The tussocks are recovering nicely, and the landowner is going to undertake future weed spraying to ensure the weeds and shrubs are kept in check. And BirdLife is also undertaking bird surveys at the site to monitor the use by the water birds. So for program 3, we're working with Wadawurrung traditional owners, Coast Care, ARRI, Parks Victoria, and Heritage Insights down at Point Lilius, which is situated at Avalon. And as you might have noticed, it's located next to the salt ponds where program 1 is focused on. Point Lilius is a small volcanic peninsula that contains a large cluster of coastal Aboriginal cultural heritage sites. Unfortunately, environmental damage resulting from poor land management has directly impacted the site's cultural significance and other cultural resources of the Wadawurrung people. So while the original intention was to improve the fringing salt marsh vegetation, that is somewhat degraded. After several site visits, Wadawurrung decided that the priority is to address the threatened grassland community, because after about 180 years of Western style management, Point Lilius has essentially been reduced to more or less a wasteland of exotic plants, which has little cultural or economic value. So we've undertaken 2 rapid veg surveys to identify the current species present, and we'll begin weed spraying within the next month because we want to control, we've identified numerous noxious weeds across the site. We've also developed a weed management plan that highlights how weed spraying, cultural burning, and seed regeneration will help recover the site over the years. And one of the big learnings from the site is, while Western knowledge is needed to help correct the issues introduced by Western culture, we found that this program, it's important to include traditional Wadawurrung knowledge and the approach that they use to ensure that corrective measures are sustained through the long term. And the 2 cultures working together is a powerful approach, and we find creates greater restoration outcomes.
Melissa, you've only got about 30 seconds to 15 minutes.
Perfect. All right. This is my last few slides. So yeah, our program 4 wasn't originally in the program, but we attained additional funding, and it's about engaging and empowering the communities on climate change action. So we want to educate local communities on the impacts of climate change and the importance of coastal wetlands. We want to get them out into the field and help get them to help us collect the scientific data that we need and help us to monitor the ongoing restoration, which can be expensive and not typically happens. And we also want to involve them where possible in the restoration work. Unfortunately, due to COVID, these were delayed and they're happening later this year. And because of the time limit, I've kind of just given a broad overview today, but I encourage you to go explore our story map for the program. It provides a lot more detail, has interactive maps where you can zoom in and see the work that's happening. We'll be posting updates there on the results and the papers that come out and additional sites that we take on. So I encourage you to check it out, and you can access it through the story map from the Blue Carbon webpage. And yeah, happy to take any questions now.
Thanks so much, Melissa.
Let's see if I can.
Right in that overview, it looks like a great project. Does anyone have any questions? Hi. Yeah. This is Kath.
Very nice talk, Melissa. Thank you very much. I have a question about whether you're actually considering any of the eroded coastlines in this program, because I know some of the like the immediately face in the big embayments is actually eroded, and whether there's any consideration about attempting to restore any of that.
Yes, definitely. We have some projects that we've sought funding for and waiting to hear the outcome, but some of them are, yeah, essentially helping revegetate the embankments to help prevent the erosion. And then, but right now, we don't have any funding to do that, but we put some in. So hopefully in the future we can do that.
Is there anyone else? Kamal?
This is a bit of a controversial question that I keep asking about the use of herbicides. You know, I know that these are large areas and you need to take out the weeds, but whether using the herbicides, is there another option?
Oh, I'm not a huge expert in weed control, but I guess for our site at Point Lilius, essentially weed spraying is really the only option because of the cultural significant sites. You're not allowed to actually essentially even put a peg in for marking a site. You can't disturb the soil. So essentially weed spraying or a cultural burn, which we're in the process of applying to do as that site's well suited for it. Yeah, those are our two options.
All right, well, I think that's it. Thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And so now it's me.